Most people think inflation is a simple problem with a simple solution. Prices rise, central banks raise interest rates, demand cools, and everything settles down. That's the story we're taught. It's clean, it's logical, and it's wrong. Because if inflation were truly easy to stop, it would not keep returning decade after decade, country after country, crisis after crisis. It would not survive the collapse of empires, the invention of modern central banking, the rise of global trade, and the most sophisticated economic models ever built. Yet it does. And that raises a disturbing question. What if inflation isn't a temporary malfunction of the system? What if it is a feature of how modern economies actually work? To understand why inflation is so hard to stop, we have to go back to a time before price charts, before policy statements, before press conferences where officials promise stability with calm voices and careful words. We have to start with something far more human: fear. Because inflation does not begin with money. It begins with behavior, with decisions made under pressure, with trade-offs that feel necessary in the moment and disastrous in hindsight. Long before central banks existed, rulers faced the same problem governments face today. How do you pay for things you cannot afford? Wars, infrastructure, social stability, survival itself. In ancient societies, the solution was often crude. Coins were shaved, diluted, or reissued with less precious metal. Officially, nothing had changed. A coin was still a coin. But quietly, trust eroded. Prices adjusted. Merchants charged more. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Inflation was born not from ignorance, but from desperation. Fast forward to the modern era, and the tools look more sophisticated, but the logic remains hauntingly similar. When economies grow, money flows easily, credit expands, and confidence reinforces itself. But when shocks hit, wars, pandemics, financial collapses, governments are forced into impossible choices. Cut spending and risk social collapse, or spend money you do not have and hope the future fixes the bill. Again and again, history shows which option is chosen. The 20th century gave us the clearest lessons. After the First World War, several European nations were drowning in debt, political instability, and social unrest. Tax bases had collapsed. Reparations loomed. Printing money seemed like the least painful option. At first, it worked. Debts were paid. Employment rose. The economy appeared to revive. But inflation is deceptive. It moves slowly at first, almost politely, before accelerating beyond control. By the time people realize what is happening, expectations have already changed. Workers demand higher wages. Businesses raise prices in anticipation. Savers flee cash. Inflation stops being a monetary phenomenon and becomes a psychological one. This is the first reason inflation is so hard to stop. Once expectations shift, the system feeds itself. Even if the original cause disappears, the behavior remains. People act not on what inflation is, but on what they believe it will be. And belief is far harder to control than interest rates. Central banks were created to solve this problem. Independent institutions, insulated from political pressure, tasked with maintaining price stability above all else. In theory, this was the final fix. No more reckless governments debasing currency. No more short-term thinking, just technocrats with models, data, and discipline. And for a while, it worked. Inflation fell, stability returned, confidence grew. But stability created its own illusion. Low inflation encouraged borrowing. Borrowing encouraged leverage. Leverage made economies fragile. And fragility meant that when shocks arrived, the response had to be fast and overwhelming. Interest rates were cut. Liquidity was injected. Emergency measures became routine. Each intervention solved the immediate problem, but quietly planted the seeds for the next one. This brings us to the second reason inflation is so difficult to stop. Modern economies are addicted to stability. Any attempt to aggressively fight inflation risks triggering recessions, financial crises, or political backlash. Policymakers know this. And so their actions are constrained not by what is economically ideal, but by what is socially survivable. The story repeats itself across decades. Inflation rises. Central banks promise to act. Markets test their resolve. Governments worry about unemployment. Voters feel pain. Pressure builds. Policy softens. Inflation lingers. Each cycle leaves behind more debt, more sensitivity to rates, and less room to maneuver. By the time inflation reaches its breaking point, the damage is already widespread. Purchasing power has eroded. Inequality has widened. Those closest to newly created money, governments, banks, asset owners, have adjusted. Those living paycheck to paycheck have not. Inflation becomes political. Blame is assigned. Narratives harden. And suddenly, fighting inflation is no longer just an economic decision. It is a social gamble. This is where many fixes fail. Raising interest rates does reduce demand, but it also increases borrowing costs for governments already drowning in debt. Cutting spending sounds responsible, but it risks destabilizing entire systems built on continuous support. Wage controls suppress symptoms but distort incentives. Price caps hide inflation temporarily, only for shortages to emerge later. Every solution creates new problems. Every delay makes the eventual adjustment harsher. And yet, the most unsettling truth is this. Inflation often survives not because policymakers do not understand it, but because stopping it requires pain that societies are unwilling to accept. Real disinflation means slower growth, higher unemployment, asset price declines, bankruptcies, political consequences. The longer inflation is tolerated, the worse the eventual cure becomes. But the shorter the tolerance, the sharper the shock. Modern parallels make this painfully clear. In recent years, global supply chains fractured, energy prices surged, labor markets tightened, and governments unleashed unprecedented fiscal and monetary support. At first, inflation was dismissed as temporary, a transitory side effect of reopening. But as months passed, it spread from goods to services, from energy to rent, from headlines to everyday life. Expectations adjusted, contracts changed, behavior shifted. Central banks responded, but cautiously. They knew the economy was fragile. They knew debt levels were historic. They knew financial markets were priced for perfection. Each rate increase was a balancing act between credibility and collapse. Inflation slowed, but did not vanish. And the longer it persisted, the clearer the pattern became. This was not an anomaly. It was history repeating itself. Data from past inflationary periods shows a striking consistency. Once inflation exceeds certain psychological thresholds, it rarely returns to target quickly. It oscillates. It resurges. It embeds itself in wages, rents, and government budgets. Even when headline numbers fall, underlying pressures remain. Services inflation lingers. Housing costs resist. Fiscal spending continues. The system adapts to higher prices rather than rejecting them. This is the final reason inflation is so hard to stop. Modern economies are not built to reverse smoothly. They are built to grow. Policies, institutions, and incentives all favor expansion over contraction. Inflation is a symptom of that bias. Fighting it requires swimming against the current of everything the system is designed to do. So what does this mean going forward? First, inflation is not defeated by a single policy move or a single year of restraint. It is a long process that tests credibility, patience, and social tolerance. Second, ignoring inflation early almost always makes it worse later. Delayed action compounds the cost. Third, the belief that we have outgrown inflationary cycles is itself a recurring historical mistake. The warning is simple, but uncomfortable. As long as societies demand growth without pain, stability without sacrifice, and solutions without consequences, inflation will remain stubbornly alive. It will change form. It will hide. It will retreat and return, but it will not disappear. The open question is not whether inflation can be stopped. History shows that it can. The real question is whether we are willing to accept the cost of stopping it before the cost becomes unavoidable. If you want to understand how past financial crises, policy failures, and hidden incentives shape the world we live in today, subscribe to the channel. Because the most dangerous economic risks are not the ones we cannot see. They are the ones we think we have already solved.